So my name is Dennis Speed, and I want to welcome everybody to today's August 10th dialogue with Lyndon LaRouche. And we have, this is an extension of sort of a topic that began on Thursday evening on a conference call, the Fireside Chat conference call. And we would urge that everybody that sees this would hear that call. On that call, which was given by Barbara Boyd, the topic was Embrace the Moon-Mars Mission, the true spark for an urgent change in culture. And it referred to the fact that we had just published this white paper called We Commit to the Moon-Mars Mission, the true spark of the changing of the culture. And this is now being circulated in about 10,000 copies. Also, it's available online, and is our immediate response to events that have begun to transpire in the United States, particularly since the beginning of July. At the point that the President of the United States returned from the trip that he had taken overseas, in which he had the meetings with Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and the head of state of North Korea, he gave a speech on the 4th of July, which reiterated a commitment that the United States would return to the moon in 2024 with a manned mission to the moon, with the first woman on the moon and a man. And then there would be a gear up for a Mars mission. And what was recognized by those of us at LaRouche PAC was that this meant a complete change in the nature of the American economy and our commitment to the people of the United States for a transformation of the physical economy of the United States. It was a commitment that was actually greater than the commitment made by John F. Kennedy in the 1960s, much more akin to what had been done by Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s. And there are reasons for that we could discuss. Subsequent to that, the British ambassador to Washington left in a huff, and other things began to happen, which have been more in the headlines recently. What we're going to do today is to take up matters that allow us to give you an actual context, the international context actually, the international and national context for what has happened since that announcement. That announcement was itself followed by President Vladimir Putin talking about the urgent necessity for the development of thermonuclear fusion power. That came 5 days after the president's speech. And then what we had was a kind of emergence of eco-fascism, as we call it, or the eco-KKK. We've seen some of that expressed in these shooters, particularly in El Paso and Dayton. But it's actually in other forms as well, something called the Extinction-Rebellion, which is a European-based organization we are renaming the Extermination Rebellion, and a kind of drive, including with the new IPCC report, to reduce the world's population by 6 billion people. And that is what is now underway. That is what is now being publicly discussed. And whether they know it or not, several of the candidates of the Democratic Party for the presidency of the United States are discussing precisely that. And so what we are going to do is we're going to do our campaign, our own campaign against the eco-clan. We're going to shut that down. We're going to make sure that people are clear about the exact actual origins and pedigree of this. But to do that, we can't do that by speaking purely about negative things. We have to talk about what the international context is of these, and the relationship between what Lyndon LaRouche and his 4 laws has stated as to what our alternative is. So we have 2 presentations today, and we want to start with Dennis Small, who has been the head of our Ibero-American organizing for many, many years, has done our work also in publications there, and it was one of the crucial persons that began our campaign earlier this year for the exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche. So, Dennis, if you are there, if you're able to hear us, we'd like you to go ahead.
I'm both here and can hear you. so I can certainly proceed. So all systems are go. The topic of my remarks today is, well, I have two titles. One is, it's time to stop living in a bubble. And the alternate title, which really goes together with it, is we'll never make it to Mars without exonerating LaRouche. Now, let's start with what Dennis was just referring to, with the question of this wave of eco-fascism, eco-terrorism that we've seen rearing its ugly head in the United States. The kinds of mass murders, the cold-blooded, bestial type of incidents that we've seen are shocking enough in themselves, but really, I think what has most people completely distraught and confused and terrorized about this is that this doesn't stop. This is just going on and on and on. And in fact, when we had the recent Dayton and then the El Paso incidents, one of the things that was commented on in the media was that this has now been upwards of 240, 250 such multiple assassinations, meaning 4 people or more, so far this year. That's more than one a day. That puts you in a whole new domain. It's a little bit like what happened around the period of the Black Death in Europe in 1347. 1347 was when the first wave of the Black Death swept Europe as a result of the collapse of the institutions at that time, and because of a speculative financial bubble that had been created. And that caused real terror and a horrible situation in the population. But that was nothing compared to what happened approximately a decade later, when a second wave of the Black Death, after the first had somewhat died down, swept the region. Because what happened is that it wasn't just a matter any longer of the horror of the specific situation and that people were dropping like flies for reasons that nobody could understand at the time or explain. But what happened is that it came back. And that kind of induced a pessimism in the population, which was almost overwhelming for the population at the time. It was overwhelming for the vast majority, because this was not only something that had happened, but it looked like that it was something that was going to keep happening, that it was now the natural, quote unquote, natural condition of man under those circumstances. And this led to such incredible cultural pessimism and decay that if you just look at the history of the time, if you look back at the statistics, the not only did the population decline, in one sense more significantly, marriages declined, births declined, any sense of the future, any sense of hope for the future was disappearing. And I think this idea of this repeat insanity has an effect on the mind of the population, which we have to take into consideration. And with the underlying issue of pessimism, which we're dealing with here, about which I'll have a little bit more to say. The sort of the response of most sane people when they look at what's happened is, have we gone mad? Has this nation and the world gone completely crazy? This is simply unintelligible. They can't figure it out. And there are partial reasons which people come up with, and you get all of these mistaken focuses on one aspect or another, that the problem is guns, the problem is videos, the problem is the Democrats, the problem is the Republicans, the problem is people are racist, the problem is people are not racist, all of these kinds of things. Now, there is an underlying ideology on this, which is very important, which is this eco-fascism idea, which of course was stated most clearly in the manifesto put out by this guy, Crusius, who's the mass shooter in the case of El Paso, Patrick Crusius. And if you could just put that first slide on the screen, I want people to read this. Well, that's the title page, so the next one, there we go. You may have read this in the press, but what he said, well, you may not have read it in the press, because what the press is focused on is how he was an anti-Hispanic, white nationalist racist, which is true, but far more significant is what he was really talking about was an eco-fascist Malthusian outlook, of which the anti-Hispanic racism was just a secondary feature. And here's what he said. He said, the decimation of the environment is creating a massive burden for future generations. Consumer culture is creating thousands of tons of unnecessary plastic waste and electronic waste. Not sure what that's supposed to mean, but I mean, most of the electronic stuff is waste, but I don't think that's what he means. And then he goes on. So the next logical step, think about that. The next logical step is to decrease the number of people in America who are using resources. If we can get rid of enough people, then our way of life can become more sustainable. Now, I challenge any of you to actually distinguish between what he said and what Prince Philip has said, saying he wants to come back as a virus to kill off more people, or what Bertrand Russell said before him, the same thing, or what Malthus said before him, and so on and so forth. There is no distinction. This is genocidal Malthusianism, where the explicit policy formulation is we have to reduce the world's population to less than 1 billion people. And 1 billion is the upper limit of the optimistic fascists. Less than 1 billion is what a lot of people are actually talking about. So this is the kind of thing that's going on around this. And I think a very significant point, and sort of the first thing that we need to do to understand what's actually going on here, is to realize that this is not an American phenomenon. This is not something that is happening in the United States or the United States alone. And I don't mean simply mass killings. What I mean is a broad international pattern unleashed by the same British financial interests with their Wall Street partners, who internationally have unleashed a wave of terrorism, destabilization, and wars, what is normally called the strategy of tensions, across the planet. Take a look at the next slide, the map that I prepared just for you to get an eyeball look at what's going on here. Yes, the United States, absolutely, over the last few weeks, this has been going on, but it's across the entire planet that the British have been doing this. Take the case of Hong Kong, what's going on in Hong Kong. There you have a situation where the same type of people, the same British-sponsored interests, have organized black bloc anarchists dressed in black, armed in black, to create a military incident in Hong Kong with the police, such that it cannot be solved unless the Chinese military come in, which they will do if they have to. They will not let this happen. And the purpose there is to then escalate this with deaths. They don't care how many people are killed, for the purpose of trying to destabilize China. Look at Iran, same type of thing in Iran, the same type of destabilization going on there with the increased sanctions. Look at Russia, demonstrations in Moscow with the purpose of destabilizing Putin. Not quite as extreme as what's happening in China, but that's the direction it's heading in. Look at the situation around Korea, North Korea, South Korea, and the escalation around that situation. Look at the situation in Venezuela, the same type of thing, with John Bolton imposing extreme sanctions on the country, the only effect of which will be to kill tens of thousands of people, and they hope overthrow the government. Or, most significantly, look at the situation in Kashmir, which is that little red star right above India on the tri-border area between Pakistan, India, and China. And what has happened there is that India, the government of India, of Modi, which is not the bad guy in the game here, but they decided that they were going to unilaterally proclaim that Jammu and Kashmir will be simply integrated into India as a normal functioning state. And Kashmir, as you may know, is a disputed area with Pakistan. There's also a disputed area on the northeastern border with China. In fact, it was the place where there had been border incidents and violence between the two countries recently. And this was a unilateral decision by the Modi government, which immediately provoked a furious response from Pakistan. The Prime Minister of Pakistan, who's also not the bad guy in this movie, Imran Khan, said this could lead to war, and it's a war that no one will win and we will all regret. The Chinese government came out against this. Opposition parties in India came out against it. And mind you, you're talking about, I mean, let's just put this in context strategically. These are three nuclear powers, Pakistan, India, and China. There is a history of military conflict between and among them. You only recently overcame actual military fighting on the border between India and China, coming off the Wuhan meeting of Modi of India and Xi Jinping of China. And the crucial question of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is a crucial part of the Belt and Road Initiative, actually runs through this area. And India, that's one of the reasons cited by India for not joining the Belt and Road, which after the issue of the United States is the second most important absence of a country on the Belt and Road or with the Belt and Road Initiative supporting it. So everything is riding on this. It's a huge strategic issue, and it could blow up the situation into an actual world war and a nuclear world war. Now, people inside India and Pakistan, I can assure you, are viewing this through, with blinders on, the way horses are given blinders so that they stay on the trodden path which the British have told them they should stay on. And they view this as a local situation. They have all the domestic explanations and causes. The same thing happens with people around the Hong Kong thing, Venezuela. Everyone has a local explanation. And the whole point of this is that this misunderstanding of the causality and who's behind this is an essential part of how such strategy of tension works. Now, what is the strategy of tension? This is the name, and I'm quoting here from one of our colleagues in Europe, Claudio Celani, who in 2004 wrote about what happened in Italy around this. And what he explained is the name strategy of tension indicates the period roughly from 1969 to 1974, when Italy was hit by a series of terrorist bombings, some of which caused large numbers of civilian deaths. The authors were right-wing extremists maneuvered by intelligence and military structures aiming at provoking a coup d'etat, or an authoritarian shift, by inducing the population to believe that the bombs were part of a communist insurgency. Now, this is simply indicative of the way this type of British strategy works. You can call it the strategy of tension. You can call it destabilization. You can call it irregular warfare. You can call it color revolutions. You can call it Tavistockian brainwashing of targeted populations. But the common thread here, and I'm pointing to this international situation so that what's happening to us here in the United States can be understood for what it actually is. It is not as it has been portrayed. This is part of a global pattern, all unleashed simultaneously by the British for their strategic objectives, which we'll come to in a moment. But the way this works is you create circumstances which heighten the fear and the terror in the population intentionally, number one. Number two, you misdirect them as to the cause of the problem. All right? You get them to focus on what is not actually causing the problem. Their emotions are extremely charged. They're understandably terrified about what's going on. You misdirect them as to what the cause is. You present that cause or the problem that they're facing as something which is so big and so huge that they can't possibly do anything about it. And you paralyze them in fear. You make sure that they become, at most, radical commentators, people who discuss what's going on, who are freaked out, who yell and scream, whether they point in the right direction or the wrong. If they're paralyzed by a misdirected understanding of what's behind this, and therefore of what an actual solution would be, then the British have won the game. And that is what their actual intention is. Their intention is to catch people inside a bubble, inside a framework or circumstances that they have defined. This is how Tavistockian brainwashing works too. It helps, of course, if you have someone as your captive, as an actual physical prisoner. Then you can actually create circumstances of such fear and terror around them that they are convinced that they cannot possibly escape from the box you have put them in unless they bend their will to yours, unless they adopt your sense of identity, unless they destroy their own sense of self. They shrink it down to the point where somehow they figure that all they can do is minor modifications in their immediate circumstances. They live in the bubble, they're caught in the bubble, they're defined by that closed system, and they can only think in strictly linear terms as the axioms of that bubble, of that closed system actually defines for them. And this is a classic British form of manipulation. If you know any of your neighbors who might perhaps be subject to such a problem, you now have a little bit of additional insight as to how this problem has been developed and potentially how to go about solving it. Now, what's going on here? Why are the British doing this? Well, the first thing to help people get out of this bubble, this impotent brainwashed state of a closed system and being reactive, is to understand that the problem that they're facing is actually far, far worse than they think it is. As bad as it looks like inside the bubble, as bad as it looks like in a closed system, the actual problem, which they don't want to look at, is far, far worse. But the irony is that if you can get people to look at that and understand it and its cause, they can begin to see what an actual solution might be. There isn't a solution inside the bubble, but if you understand what's actually going on, then you can start to put together not only an idea, but a coalition of forces that can actually function. Now, what are we dealing with here? We're dealing with a situation of the complete implosion and collapse of a global system, a financial system, which is utterly and completely bankrupt, which has developed a derivatives and related bubble of approximately $1.5 quadrillion. To salvage that system, the British are fully prepared and are deployed to launch thermonuclear warfare between the United States and Russia, United States and China and other countries. And they are fully prepared to butcher and get rid of 6 billion people on the planet. Now, if you think about it for a second, those two policy intentions of the British, thermonuclear war and wiping out 6/7 of the world's population, is actually a lot worse than the kind of blind terrorism that we've seen in the United States. And yet, if you understand that that's what the policy is and why that's the case, you can start to work a way out of this. Now, look at what's happened. Since 2008, when the last crisis, the big financial crisis, hit, until approximately 2015, Wall Street and the City of London were deployed with a policy of first total bailout and quantitative easing to somehow salvage the bubble and keep things afloat. That worked for a little while, not that it was solving the problem, but the rate of increase of the monetary aggregates through quantitative easing was such that it has so far prevented a blowout of that bubble. What they tried to do in about 2015, when it was clear that that approach wasn't going to work anymore, is they made a shift into what they called the bail-in. Instead of bail-out, bail-in. So instead of quantitative easing, it was what we called quantitative stealing, which is they simply steal the entirety of bank deposits that individuals, companies, countries have, and drastically reduce their standard of living by that process. Now, for reasons that are not worth going through in detail at this point, well, it's worth going through, but I want to instead spend the time that we have on a deeper subject related to this. But it didn't work. And that form of bailout has not functioned whatsoever. So you're now facing a situation, as I'll quickly show you in the next three graphs, and I'll do this quickly because I know I've shown you these graphs before. If you could throw them up on the screen, I'd appreciate that. This is a version of Larouche's triple curve, which he helped develop and to present in this fashion, that shows what happens not only when the rate of increase of monetary aggregates is greater than the increase of financial aggregates, but that no matter how rapidly you increase monetary aggregates, i.e. quantitative easing, you begin to have an implosion of the financial aggregates. In other words, the whole thing goes up in smoke. And that, of course, leads to a further collapse of the physical economic aggregates. Now, the next slide shows that that is, in fact, what has been occurring. If you look at financial aggregates, you're familiar with this curve. We've shown it before, this graph, which shows a slowdown of the rate of growth around 2007, and then a beginning of a drop-off. But then if you look at the next graph, you'll see that when you compare the two rates of growth and change of the financial aggregates on the one hand and the quantitative easing on the other, you can see that the world is in exactly the bind that Larouche said. This is the fact. This does not work for them. They've got to come up with another problem. And this is where you have the shift that's going on into this extremely activated stage of the green fascist bailout. Now, this isn't a new policy. They didn't come up with this in 2015. This has been their policy for 50 years. This has been Lyndon LaRouche's battle with them for 50 years, is over Malthusianism versus LaRouche's concept of man's creativity being the source of unending, potentially unending, continuous scientific progress. But they've deployed on this thing big time now, and they are, number one, financing an actual Nazi fascist movement of shock troops, of which we have begun to see actual terrorist activity, and they plan to do more of this. Number two, they are attempting to bail themselves out by unleashing a gigantic financial bubble around the green economy, which won't work, but it'll, they hope, provide the illusion of a bailout for as long as perhaps the bail-in did, or the bailout did, excuse me, the quantitative easing. But the third component of this is that the actual economic policies of low energy flux density, of reducing the physical economy, means the kind of austerity which we know from Nazi Germany. We're talking about concentration camp destruction of millions or hundreds of millions of people. That's their policy, reducing the world population through that kind of collapse of the physical economy. If you do what COP21 and these people say, of denuclearize and decarbonize, de-meat-ize, de-everything-ize human society, declothe-ize, they're talking about doing that. They're even saying that fashion models should not, their clothing is damaging to the environment. I actually think that's a ploy on their part, because if they got these unfortunate anorexic girls to disrobe and get rid of their clothing, that would probably automatically reduce the world population by a couple of billion immediately, for the obvious reasons. I don't mean to have morbid humor about this, but you gotta understand the insanity of this type of situation, of what they're proposing. That's what they're doing. That's their policy. That's what they're trying to do. And they've got a number of problems. One problem is LaRouche and his movement. Another problem is that Trump doesn't want any part of this. He's said no on the Paris Accord. He's counterposed the idea of the space program. And internationally, there's opposition as well. Perhaps the most serious and dangerous weapon of mass destruction that the British have to deploy is not economic collapse. It is not eco-fascist terrorism. It is not a financial bubble. All of those things are almost copied exactly from what was done under Nazi Germany. I mean, these guys can't come up with a new one. That was done by the British then. They're doing the same thing now. That's not the most serious weapon of mass destruction. The most serious weapon of mass destruction is pessimism. To convince people that there isn't a solution. To induce in them what is actually an unnatural state or condition of the human mind. Because pessimism is not natural. In fact, I would argue, and I refer back to a discussion which happened before we went live with this broadcast, but a discussion which Dennis Speed was talking about on the question of the nature of good and evil, the false Manichaean view that there is both an existence called good and an existence called evil, and they're in perpetual combat, which is not true. On any level, it's not true. But I would argue that the exact same thing applies when we consider the question of optimism and pessimism. Pessimism is not something that has actual ontological existence. It is the absence of optimism, which is the natural condition of the human mind. If you want to make people pessimistic, you have to first bestialize them. You have to first remove that which distinguishes human beings as human beings, which is their sense of creativity and morality, and therefore their commitment to the future and their sense of identity as part of an eternal an immortal species. If you can do that, then pessimism blossoms as the absence of optimism, just as darkness will blossom as the absence of light, or evil will blossom as the absence of absence of good, excuse me. Now, how does this thing actually work? Well, the crucial question is, of course, the question of space and the space program and LaRouche's proposal around this. And I think it's important to remind people that the fourth law of LaRouche's four laws, as you're undoubtedly familiar with, is the issue of the kind of unending scientific revolution which is required, especially focused on space and on fusion power that can propel mankind into the future, not just in terms of that immediate program, but as a shift in human identity, which is what's needed to actually solve the problems of the planet. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because this is why I say that we will not make it to Mars unless we exonerate LaRouche. Helga Zepp LaRouche has argued in recent months, in the 6 months really since her husband Lyndon passed away, which was almost 6 months ago, February 12th of this year, that the exoneration of LaRouche will produce an explosion of interest, study, and creativity in the populations that are allowed to have access to his thinking and ideas, similar to what happened when Plato and his ideas were brought back into Europe by Nicholas of Cusa and his co-thinkers. It's what unleashed the Golden Renaissance in Western European civilization. And that LaRouche's relationship to this is very similar to what happened when Plato was brought back to Europe. Now, why? Well, let me make use of some of the discussion presented by Lyndon LaRouche in a document called Jesus Christ and Civilization, which he wrote and published on September 22nd, 2000. And I do that because I'm actually not ready for the first slide yet. I'll tell you. I got another thing I want to say first. Thanks. I want to do this because what LaRouche talks about are what he calls the three great benchmarks in the advance of Western civilization. And he poses the task of what he's going to discuss in this document, where he says the following: is it possible that even the mastering of the immediate financial crisis, this was 2000, right, requires that we must also act now to overcome the more distant threat of a new dark age? In other words, although I have shown how the world could recover from the presently onrushing global financial collapse, perhaps the world will not adopt that option I have given it. Is there then some deeper, longer range sickness within the world's presently leading institutions which, as seems probable at this moment, would prevent the world from accepting such a workable near-term recovery program? Therefore, he says, I present here the case for thus linking the two questions, the immediate crisis and the times beyond. He then goes on to say that there are three great benchmarks, he calls them, of the entire history of Western civilization. And now I'll take the first slide, please. And this is an excerpt from that document, which I invite you to read. I strongly recommend it. It's not what you think. He says, taken as a whole, the recent 2,500 years of rise of that adopted child of Egypt, that the birth and development of the new globally extended European civilization, is to be understood in terms of the three greatest benchmarks of its entire history. The consolidation of the development of classical Greek culture around the leading figure of Plato, number one. Number two, the ministry and crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And number three, the Golden Renaissance. So that's what LaRouche identifies as the three absolutely critical benchmarks, he calls it, or nodal points in the development of our entire Western civilization, our Western Judeo-Christian civilization, I would say. He then goes on to say that there are other moments that are important to recognize in this. We're not excluding them, like 1776 in the United States, like the German classical period, and others, but that you got to look at these three moments in particular. And that's what he then goes into in depth. And I'm just sort of going to give you some teasers on this to whet your appetite to think this through further and bring it back to the issue of how we solve the current crisis. He says, first, Plato. What does Plato do? Well, what Plato does is he establishes that man is made in the image of the Creator. He says the way he does this is he establishes that man is capable of understanding universal principles, which are ideas, but he is also capable of having an idea of ideas, and that's what man's mind is. Other times, LaRouche refers to this as the hypothesizing the higher hypothesis. So what LaRouche says about Plato is he says, three most characteristic and also multiply connected notions of Plato's work as a whole are to be recognized there. He's talking about the Republic and also Timaeus in particular. He says, these are, 1, the principle of truthfulness and justice. 2, the supreme principle of law identified by Paul's use of Plato's definition for the Greek term agape, and by the idea of all ideas, the idea of man. This defines man implicitly, as distinct from all other living beings, the efficiently human personality of the human individual, as created in the image of the efficient mind of the composer or creator of the universe. So it's this discovery of rigorous cognition, its application to the idea of truth and justice, and this discovery of what the idea of man is as the idea of the idea that Plato develops. And I cannot resist, you'll forgive me, from quoting from the Gorgias dialogue of Plato. Lynn does not quote this in particular in his piece, but I think it's exactly on this point where he's having a huge brawl with the sophists and the Hobbesians of his day, with Thrasymachus, with Callicles, and others. And they tell him, oh, come on, everybody knows that justice is simply the power of the strongest person, and you would capitulate to this too, basically saying you could be brainwashed as well if we had power and control. Mind you, he's on his way to his trial where he's ultimately killed. And they tell him that you're just bullshitting us, Socrates. You would cave as well. You too can be turned into a brainwashed zombie. And he talks to Callicles and he says, no, Callicles, I'm persuaded of the truth of these things. I desire only to know the truth and to live as well as I can. And when I die, to die as well as I can. And to the utmost of my power, I exhort all other men to do the same. As for the question of justice, he says, to do injustice is more to be avoided than to suffer injustice. Think not only of Socrates, think of Larouche and his jailing on the issue of the exoneration. It is worse to do an injustice than to suffer an injustice. And then he tells people, follow me then, and I will lead you where you will be happy in life and after death, as the argument shows. And never mind if someone despises you as a fool and insults you, if he has a mind. Let him strike you by Zeus, and do you be of good cheer, and do not mind the insulting blow, for you will never come to any harm in the practice of virtue if you are a really good and true man. And then he says, being a recruiter, he says, and when we have practiced virtue together, we will apply ourselves to politics, if that seemed desirable. So that was Socrates recruiting to the LPAC of the day. So, okay, that's the Plato concept that Larouche presents. And then he says, okay, now let's talk about what happened with Jesus Christ, and in particular the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And I really want to emphasize for people that this is not a religious argument. It is a philosophical and a theological argument, which has implications of all sorts to people of all different kinds of religious creeds and rites. So LaRouche raises the question, okay, what happened with Jesus Christ? How do we differentiate functionally Plato's Socrates from Christ? And what he says is that the key to this thing is the issue of the part of the Christian doctrine which is embedded, he says, within a single phrase of the Christian creed and of the Son. What he's talking about is the filioque, the idea that the Holy Spirit proceeds both from God the Father and from the Son. That is to say, what underlies this is a question of the immortality of man, if and to the degree that he partakes of that creativity which the Creator has shared with him in part, i.e., not creativity equal to God's, but similar to God's in that man can be creative and participate in the Creator's process of creation. So LaRouche says that's the crucial question. And he says the way this shows up is in what LaRouche calls the mystery of the crucifixion. Now, let me read what he says. That in turn poses the question, what is the essential, necessary significance of the crucifixion which makes Christianity so powerful an idea of ideas? Therein lies the mystery of Christ. And then LaRouche explains, this is not a mystery in the sense of being inherently inexplicable to reason. It is a mystery in the sense it appears in the form of a profound ontological paradox which can be made comprehensible only by mustering within oneself the relevant cognitive action of discovery. And then he elaborates, the crucial conception, the idea of ideas, which makes that connection comprehensible, is the notion of the simultaneity of eternity. There lies the key to the challenge of that great metaphor, the historical mystery of Christ. So again, not in religious terms, but in terms of understanding the issue of man's immortality, the simultaneity of eternity. How is it possible that man is at the same time mortal and immortal? It's an apparent paradox. And the solution to that is what is actually the greatest power which Christianity created. And LaRouche actually goes on to say, this is key to all of the developments, the positive developments in physical economy. He says, it is no mere coincidence that this notion of simultaneity of eternity is the most interesting, important, and profitable idea in all physical science, including physical economy. Okay, now, so much for Plato, very briefly. So much for Christianity, extremely briefly. Now, Nicholas of Cusa. And you'll see in a moment why I'm going through this process of development and how it relates to us today. So he takes up Cusa and he says, look, the issue with Cusa is the revival of Plato and Socrates. That's how this actually occurred. Can you put the next slide up on the screen, please? He says, it was the cultural shock of the establishment of the great Greek classical revival at Padua at the beginning of the 15th century. The latter was the classical Greek revival which produced the leading intellectual forces of the Renaissance as typified by Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa and his friends. So it's the introduction or the reintroduction of Plato into Western civilization in the 15th century with Cusa, which provides the basis. Those are the shoulders on which Cusa stood. Let's put it that way. Without those shoulders, Cusa would have been a different situation. But he also, Cusa, stood above in his achievements what had been accomplished previously by the two previous major developments under Plato and under the development of emergence of Christianity as such. LaRouche refers to two documents of Cusa's, Concordancia Católica and De Docta Ignorancia, as being indicative of the Cusa revolution. And among the things he said or says there is that it was the confluence of these two new institutions, the use of classical Greek principles of artistic composition for creating the modern sovereign nation state, and the fostering of science-driven progress in the productive powers of labor per capita and per square kilometer, which is the distinguishing essence of the revolutionary successes of globally extended modern European civilization. In other words, it was the application of this previous breakthrough to the creation of a nation state and the application of this concept, the simultaneity of eternity, to physical economy, which opened the floodgates to a revolution in science. That's why LaRouche refers to Couza as the father of modern science, which in turn made expressed in man's actual development of a principle that pre-existed that development, to be sure, as shown by Plato, but was not an actual functional part the way it became with the period of the Golden Renaissance and with the explosion of potential relative population, which population density, which ensued therefrom. So that's how this worked. In other words, what happened is that the idea of ideas, man's creativity, was picked up and taken by Couza in an application in a form which made man's own creative powers the actual subject of science itself. In other words, it is Couza who demonstrates the subjectivity of science, not in the sense of you can believe whatever you want and that's scientific. No, that science is actually the science or the understanding of man's mind's interaction and ongoing creation with the anti-entropic universe which surrounds him. That's Couza. That's the advance over the previous two phases. And that's what LaRouche then picks up and says, this is what now brings us to the current situation. Okay, what does this have to do with the exoneration of LaRouche? Well, look, what's involved in fusion-driven space exploration, which was Lin's fourth law and the most important, really. It's the one that defines the other three as leading up into it. It is a unity, as has been discussed on a number of other occasions, but this in particular points to the uniquely human quality which has to guide our work towards the future. And that is uniquely defined by Lin as the revolution in fusion power, in particular, to power space exploration. Why? It's not just that we're going to be able to get out there faster. We will. It's not just that we'll be able to get out there safer. That we will too. It's that we will be, by so doing, not just learning about new areas of the universe that we didn't know, not just that we'll finally be able to visit Mars or that part of the solar system, it's how we do it. And again, think about Couza. It's how we do that. Fusion energy is actually congruent with the universal principle on which the solar system functions. It's kind of the height of arrogance to think that somehow you're going to be able to go out there into the solar system, which is governed by gravitation, Kepler's discovery of universal gravitation, and the sun's power, which is fusion power, as the source of that's driving this entire process, and to think we're somehow going to do that with fossil fuels or or chemical energy or something like that. It's really pretty ridiculous if you think about that. Not only that, how fast will we be traveling if we go at a 1 gravity acceleration halfway to Mars and another gravity acceleration or deceleration for the downhill side of the trip, so to speak? Well, my friends in the scientific team of the basement, LaRouche's basement team, tell me that we will be actually traveling at a speed which is approximately 1/10 the speed of light. This is why Berlin refers to this as you get into a relativistic domain. Now, 1/10 of the speed of light may not sound like a lot, but think about that for a second. Light travels at about 186,000 miles per second, excuse me. So we're talking about traveling about 2,000 miles per second at the height of our travel. Now, that's very fast. it's almost as fast and as difficult to conceptualize that as it is to conceptualize 2 trillion galaxies. Helga has talked about this repeatedly about, okay, I can sort of think about a galaxy, but 2 trillion galaxies, which we know to exist, let alone what may also exist, it really stretches the imagination. I think talking about 2,000 miles per second also stretches the imagination. It's quite something. But it poses a much deeper issue, because what we now know to be the actual lawful ordering of the universe, as Einstein discussed in that we are dealing with a finite but unbounded universe, where we were talking about his general theory of relativity, when you begin to get into that relativistic domain of travel, we have no idea what we're going to find. It's entirely new. It's entirely different. It's a totally different approach to discovery itself. It's as different as a flat surface is from a curved surface. And the question of curvature, again, remember, when Lynn talks about curvature, this is a metaphor. He's not, yeah, sure, it helps to conceptualize the issue of curvature when you think of a surface which is not flat, like Euclid said, but curved like Earth, or you can think of an irregular or a non-constant curvature, like an ellipsoid or something like that. You can conceptualize a Riemannian idea of a process of change of curvature. But the way Lynn has actually discussed this is that curvature is simply the projection into the domain of the measurable and the experienceable by man of entirely new physical principles. In other words, what we're going into is a domain which we don't know. The only thing we know is that our mind is potentially capable of understanding it, because we know as an absolute scientific certainty that the principles governing man's creativity is the principle of creativity governing the physical universe in its totality. That we know, that we can prove. That's what LaRouche has proven. So this puts us into a domain which all we know is that man's mind is the metric of the universe. And all the rest is up for grabs. We'll be able perhaps to understand things that we now cannot, like black holes, right? And things like that, which have no explanation under the currently known physical laws of the universe. But they are understandable to man's mind. That you can state even before the fact. So the whole question of launching this kind of program, of a space program, not just, hey, let's get out there and why don't we go to the moon and Mars. What we're talking about is an entirely new way in which man's mind is going to discover and know the universe. Not just new places. It's not just going further down the street to a new corner, to another shopping mall. It's different. Everything is different except man's creativity. That is the one thing that we know will continue to allow us to measure ourselves and science and the universe. Therefore, when LaRouche says, as one of his 4 fundamental laws, and the most important of them, of what we must now do, and as we talk about the Moon-Mars program, as LaRouche defines it, as Kraft Erica defines it, nobody else, we are talking about the kinds of changes and return to man's sense of identity, which is the kind of transformation which Cusa produced by standing on Plato's shoulders. And if we do not achieve the exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche, we are not going to get to Mars. And in fact, the human species may well disappear. That, I think, is a fairly strong argument to achieve his exoneration. So that's what I wanted to present to you today.
Thank you, Dennis. Now to discuss exactly how we intend to do that, I want to introduce Daniel Burke. As I think many of you know, and he'll make you all aware of this, he is a candidate for the United States Senate for the state of New Jersey. He will have something called an opponent, in particular, by the name of Cory Booker, who, once he discovers that he does not exist as a presidential candidate, will probably decide he's still running for the office he ostensibly holds. but to talk about what is much more important to us, which is the importance not only of that race for Jersey, but for the United States and for what you've just heard. I want to have Daniel come and speak, and then we will, after him, have a chance to ask questions of both. So, Daniel?
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you. Okay, let me get myself set up here. So, yes, my name's Daniel Burke. I'm running for U.S. Senate in New Jersey. I want to speak to you from the standpoint of the new paradigm. We're on a mission. We're on a 40-year mission. We're on a mankind mission. Are you part of this mission? Whether you know it or not, you are. There is a real future that's pulling us forward. Over the past 40 years, 800 million people have been brought out of poverty by the government of China. Thanks to Lyndon LaRouche's 1987 video production, The Woman on Mars, we have already received the inaugural transmission of the first operational human colony on Mars. You'll have to watch the video to see what I mean. Visionary scientists are working today in the state of New Jersey and other places to create the means to launch fusion rockets, which will make a trip to Mars. And as Ben Denniston described to us, what would otherwise take 200 days by chemical rockets, we will be able to achieve within 2 days by fusion rockets. They're working on that presently in New Jersey and in other locations across the world. And, for some context, imagine that around 1830, it would take 2 days to go from here to Washington, D.C. Governments around the world are investigating the question of whether the vast quantities of helium-3 that we believe are found on the moon can be harvested as fuel for a thermonuclear fusion Moon-Mars economy for the world, or for the human species. And, as Dennis referenced earlier, the president announced on July 4th that the United States is going to put an astronaut on Mars. Astronauts. We're going there. So I'm going to keep on repeating this through my campaign. If the Artemis mission is successful, then when my daughter is 6 years old, she will watch live on television, or on a device, I suppose. She will watch live Americans landing on the moon. Human beings returning to the moon. When she's 6 years old, 5 years from now. And meanwhile, her father, me, when I was 15 years old, I and my generation watched the World Trade Center be destroyed. The World Trade Center towers being destroyed on live TV. That's what we saw. So, if it's true that we're in this mission, then, and whether you like it or not, you're in it, then the question is, will it be successful? So we've referred many, many times at these meetings, and indeed today, to the idea of optimism. We want to spread optimism. We're against pessimism. So what is optimism? And I was thinking about what the popular conceptions are. And of course, the one that comes to mind immediately is, are you a glass half full kind of person or a glass half empty kind of person? Right? Or always look on the bright side of life, or look for the silver lining in every cloud. Positive energy, good vibes, right? You want to have a mindset, or people say that it's a life skill. Optimism is a life skill. They say, choose to be optimistic. It feels better. And I learned on Oprah.com that a key component of optimism seems to be the willingness to look for the bright side, even if that means distorting reality. So this idea of optimism might include taking some drugs. But, okay, so no! Optimism is freedom from the prison of the senses. Okay, can you bring this up? Ooh, here's my title. Optimism in the Age of LaRouche. In 1903, when she was 23 years old and finishing college, Helen Keller wrote this beautiful short treatise called Optimism. And I encountered it for the first time this week, and I can highly recommend that you read it. And I'm going to quote from it. Oh, oops, I left my clicker. Can I have that, please? Thank you. So there she is with Anne Sullivan. Once I knew the depth where no hope was, and darkness lay on the face of all things. Then love came and set my soul free. Once I knew only darkness and stillness. Now I know hope and joy. Once I fretted and beat myself against the wall that shut me in. Now I rejoice in the consciousness that I can think, act, and attain heaven. My life was without past or future. Death, the pessimist would say, a consummation devoutly to be wished. But a little word from the fingers of another fell into my hand that clutched at emptiness, and my heart leaped to the rapture of living. Night fled before the day of thought, and love and joy and hope came up in a passion of obedience to knowledge. Can anyone who has escaped such captivity, who has felt the thrill and glory of freedom, be a pessimist? Last week, and then we referenced this, of course, again already today, but President Trump declared in his comments on the mass shootings in El Paso and Dayton, quote, "Cultural change is hard, but each of us can choose to build a culture that celebrates the inherent worth and dignity of every human life. Optimism is the joyful recognition of the true existence of human creativity." There. Here's more from Helen Keller. Thus, from philosophy, I learned that we see only shadows and know only in part, and that all things change. But the mind, the unconquerable mind, compasses all truth, embraces the universe as it is, converts the shadows to realities, and makes tumultuous changes seem but moments in an eternal silence, or short lines in the infinite theme of perfection, and the evil but a halt on the way to good. Though with my hand I grasp only a small part of the universe, with my spirit I see the whole, and in my thought I can compass the beneficent laws by which it is governed. The confidence and trust which these conceptions inspire teach me to rest safe in my life as in a fate, and protect me from spectral doubts and fears. Okay, I'm going to read this one because I thought I had the slide for it. But optimism is our morality. Can you turn it off for a moment while I read? Okay. Optimism is our morality. Here's what she says. Let pessimism once take hold of the mind, and the life is all topsy-turvy, all vanity and vexation of spirit. There is no cure for individual or social disorder except in forgetfulness and annihilation. Let us eat, drink, and be merry, says the pessimist, for tomorrow we will die. If I regarded my life from the point of view of the pessimist, I should be undone. I should seek in vain for the light that does not visit my eyes and the music that does not ring in my ears. I should beg night and day and never be satisfied. I should sit apart in awful solitude, a prey to fear and despair. But since I consider it a duty to myself and to others to be happy, I escape a misery worse than any physical deprivation. Okay, so now I have from Mr. Larouche, I think a related concept. This is from the Substance of Morality, which he wrote in 1998. Justice, truthfulness, and those creative powers by means of which we may discover valid revolutionary principles of our universe form a seamless whole in which classical culture, morality, and physical science are united by a common passion for universal justice and truth. These issues of truth and justice are associated empirically with tests of humanity's increased power over the physical universe, per capita and per square kilometer of the Earth's surface. The increased development of the average newborn individual, the increase of per capita power, the maintenance of the increase of those improvements in demographic and productive characteristics and so forth are typical of the evidence by means of which we may know that changes in knowledge for practice are in accord with the Creator's intent for the laws of the universe. This accords with justice, as justice means a more adequate participation of each individual life as a world historical being, a life so dwelling in the simultaneity of eternity, a mental life thus situated in the further development of the condition of all mankind. People may be familiar with this. So optimism is agape. It means that we have faith in our unique human creative powers to act for all mankind. And this is proof of that. This is the empirical proof that Larouche was just referring to. Because at every point that this chart goes up, it represents an individual human commitment to mankind as a whole, to using a discovery of the laws of the universe to increase the power of mankind to do good. So optimism is agape. It means we have faith in our unique human creative powers to act for all mankind. Okay, so does that mean that I'm calling you immoral and unloving if you're pessimistic about the next 50 years? Yes, absolutely. We need to educate our emotions, right? That we feel anguish about the pessimism that we've practiced as a society, as individuals, and a correspondent joy at the awakening of optimism in ourselves and others. And you'd better look around you and realize that the young generation of the United States suffers from this curse the most. And not merely the United States. You have to look at what's happening in Europe. You have to look at what's happening in every continent. I mention Europe because of the incredible attack on Germany that's taking place right now in the form of cultural pessimism. So what are the student population of the United States doing inside their minds? What are they thinking about? Are they lying in bed contemplating the sheer magnitude of galaxies in known universe, over 2 trillion of them? How many are filled with compassion for those suffering in the war-torn and impoverished parts of the world? For Yemen, where children are starving in large numbers? How many are dreaming up solutions to these profound problems? Some of them are. Some of them are. And those are very important young individuals. But in the large, they are being instructed by British propaganda, specifically British propaganda, to believe that the world faces a total climate catastrophe. Extinction, in fact, because of the inherently destructive human race. So this happens in schools at a very young age. I told the story here last week of the decision I made to join the LaRouche movement, and I'll just tell it again briefly, which is that I was teaching middle school in Manhattan, and I was teaching fifth graders environmental science, and I was given a lesson plan, and this lesson plan said, put up 4 things across the 4 signs all over the room that say agree, strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree, and then ask the kids these questions. And the first question was, is 7 billion people too much? And this lesson plan came from Prince Philip's World Wildlife Fund. That's where it came from. So there's no exaggeration here, there's no distance. This was at a school that's not far from here. It's not just at the schools, right? Because it's the massive, activity of the media. So if you turn, I think it's funny if you turn on Bloomberg or one of these business programs and you listen to them discuss the streaming industry, which is to say Netflix. There's this whole discussion that's going on right now, and about how the business is doing. And they say this hilarious phrase. I've heard it like multiple times. The competition for eyeballs is fierce, which sounds like the media is trafficking human organs. And they're like, the price of frontal lobes has skyrocketed. So what are they streaming, right? What are people getting? They're getting cultural rot. They're getting David Attenborough. David Attenborough has been extremely popular since I was in college when he started the Planet Earth series. And David Attenborough specifically says that Ethiopia's economic woes come from the fact that they have such a high population density. Okay, he has said in the past year he was railing against President Trump for pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, and he said, we have to make sure that human population growth ends. He wants to end all human population growth, and he's not even the most fanatic of them. And this is, people know. If you get to Netflix, you're going to see the blue planet, planet Earth, all this stuff. People sit around and they do drugs and they watch this kind of thing. So that's what people are receiving. And this is the legacy of the British Empire's Bertrand Russell, whom LaRouche identified as the most evil man of the 20th century. And here I'll quote the quote that we love to quote because it's so terrifying and clearly behind this process. Quote from Bertrand Russell. The social psychologists of the future will have a number of classes of school children on whom they will try different methods of producing an unshakable conviction that snow is black. Various results will soon be arrived at. First, that the influence of home is obstructive. Second, that not much can be done unless indoctrination begins before the age of 10. Third, that verses set to music and repeatedly intoned are very effective. Fourth, that the opinion that snow is white must be held to show a morbid taste for eccentricity. But I anticipate. It is for future scientists to make these maxims precise and discover exactly how much it costs per head to make children believe that snow is black, and how much less it would cost to make them believe it is dark gray. So, will you allow this evil and its traces to entrap the minds of the youth? Because under this kind of spell, what are they not thinking about? How will you personally increase the compassion of the young generation? How will you personally act to increase the compassion of the young generation. Awaken your passion to do so, and I'm sure you will have so many ideas on how to do it. Will you be their Anne Sullivan? We need an army of Anne Sullivans devoted to banishing this darkness of the British Empire, of this green fascism, this anti-human view, this zero-growth ideology. If we have that, then you're going to create a generation of Helen Kellers. So, let me take a moment and show a little video, okay? Because you have to get out and organize. That's what I keep saying, right? So come on out and organize, and then you'll meet the most wonderful people who are inspired by the same ideas that we are, and we're going to organize and become a more powerful force and win the victory. So this is from on two times this week. I went out in the street with teams with my friend Darwin, with and several members of the LaRouche movement, and we set up with this beautiful big sign that says Apollo 1969, Artemis 2019. And it has a picture of the astronaut walking on the surface of the moon. And we were doing that, and we ran into this wonderful woman here. So please go ahead and play it. Let's hear what she has to say. Ooh, is the sound working? Met because we were out here with our big sign on the Apollo program and the Artemis program. And what was it you were just saying about the importance of the space program?
Yeah, at this point in our evolution, our species need to come together to save our species, and we need to unite together as a species. And the way to do it is that if we can have a perspective from space, there's no border when we look down on this blue ball, the Earth. It's just one globe, and there's no border in between all of us. So it doesn't really matter what color we are, what race we are. We are all the same species, and so it's so important to be able to bring us to start to go to another planet. In order to understand that what we have here is so precious together, we need to work together.
Oh, we met because we... Thank you. Yeah. So if, imagine this. Imagine that channeling John Kennedy from 1963, who announced his proposal at the United Nations about a month before he was assassinated for the moon mission, the moon landing, to be done as a joint program with the USSR. Imagine if channeling that, the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of India, the President of Russia, the President of China, if they came together at this United Nations and adopted the four powers agreement that Mr. LaRouche proposed, which was for that, which in this what we're talking about is for these four nations to anchor a Moon-Mars mission for the next 50 years, and to reorganize the world economy according to that devotion to human progress. So the LaRouche movement and my Senate campaign are challenging you to look at the worst problems and imagine sincerely how they can be physically solved with human creativity. And I just want to really support the conception that Dennis Small went through about the role of LaRouche, the reintroduction of LaRouche relative to the introduction of Plato in Florence in the 1400s. We need a study of Plato, of Leibniz, who originated the true notion of optimism. He's the person who coined that word. That we live in the best of all possible universes. We need a study of LaRouche, whose science of physical economy gives us the potential to bring about 1 trillion people in the human race, whose work has been banned from discussion on American university campuses and many other nations as well. They don't teach. They don't allow LaRouche to be discussed. That's a ban that we intend to lift in coming weeks through the Senate campaign, and not merely through the Senate campaign, because we're going to be doing this with an international effort. We need a vanguard of youth who can see that these discoveries are necessary for the next 50 years of humanity. So in 50 years, they will be in their 70s and 80s. And what will they be able to celebrate in your name? Whether you'll be there with them or not. Thank you.
Okay, so the floor is now open for questions, and you can go to the microphone over here. Dennis is available for questions, and of course Daniel. So people should start to line up now. And if there's any problem at that microphone, they can also use this one. You okay? Okay.
Hi, this is Fred from New Jersey. Dennis, your presentation today, I have with me here. I was just going through Lynn's book, The Science of Christian Economy. And with everything that you're talking about, coups, Leibniz, and so forth, I went through a section of the book here, and it's entitled The Reproduction of Man. So with all of that, could you go through, or at least tell us, what Lynn is discussing in this section? Thank you.
Well, I don't have that right in front of me, but what he means by the reproduction of man, well, first let's say, well, what do you mean when you say man? Man and woman, humankind, mankind. What are you talking about? Are you talking about simply the physiological reproduction of our species? Well, that's part of it. Are you talking about economic reproduction? That is to say, to have growth which is expanding quantitatively and qualitatively to be able to allow for a rising potential relative population density? Well, that's important too. Are you talking about reproducing man's discoveries and scientific advances and spreading them to the entirety of the population of the planet? Sort of continuing the process of what the Chinese have done by wiping out poverty, and they really have wiped it out at this point in China. That is to say, to make available to the entire planet the benefits of the level of technological growth that we have now. Well, that's part of it as well. But if man is actually the unique species capable of coming up with not only ideas, universal ideas which are non-Aristotelian, that is to say, which go beyond sense certainty into understanding universal concepts, like the beautiful quotes from Helen Keller that Daniel was just going through. And if man is the only one actually capable of generating the idea of ideas, that is, of the power to reproduce those ideas, then what does it mean to talk about the reproduction of man? What you're actually talking about when you say the reproduction of man is you're talking about reproducing, i.e. Recreating on a higher level, that quality of creative mentation which distinguishes us from other species. This is why, one of the reasons why I believe Helga always has emphasized most recently that in addition to the space program as such, which is in fact the key to creating the scientific breakthroughs that are required for all of these things, what's absolutely fundamental, in fact, it's the same issue, is a classical cultural revolution. We need to just as we need to return to Plato and return to LaRouche to develop the even more advanced concepts, so too in classical culture, we have to develop that capability to generate artistic emotions, educate our emotions in a way that is coherent with, conducive to, and encourages and expands our ability to engage in creative thought more broadly. So when we're talking about the reproduction of man, we're talking about recreating that capability in our entire species. That is why people often say, well, if you tell me how a culture treats its elderly or its prisoners, I'll tell you what that culture is. Because it's not just a question of some people being treated that way. The real problem is that when we tolerate, when we allow what has happened in Africa to occur there, if we tolerate treating Hispanics in this country as less than human beings, if we tolerate looking at people of another race as subhuman, if we look at Chinese as somehow a different culture, a non-Caucasian culture, as was stated most expressively by the fortunately former head of policy planning at the State Department, the Chiron Skinner, who happens to have a black skin, although more relevant is the fact that she has a black soul capable of thinking in those terms. To the degree to which we tolerate that in ourselves, we are damaging ourselves more than the victims of those policies, because we are acting in less than a human way. So I think that what Lynn is actually talking about in terms of the reproduction of man is creating the conditions and the circumstances in which not only do we have an unending leapfrogging of technologies moving forward, but we are creating the social circumstances, the cultural circumstances in which those joys and benefits of what it means to be human are extended throughout the entire species. And it's that quality of mind, it's that sense of science as a subjective issue that Cusa developed, which is really what we're dealing with here when we talk about the reproduction of man. I have no idea if that's what you were actually referring to, but that's what came to mind in response to the question you were raising. Not hearing you.
All right, take care.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, next.
Well, I'm very powerfully impacted by Dennis Speed and Dennis Small and Daniel Burke's presentations today. I was going to take the day off, but then I decided that the tide was turning and maybe I'd better pay attention to it. So I really want to say that I joined the LaRouche movement not realizing what I didn't know and how I had been brainwashed by the liberal thinking I was a liberal and a do-gooder and all that, which is to say that I was oblivious of how my own thinking had been seriously misguided. So the clarity with which Dennis Speed differentiated between good and evil, and evil being the absence of being able to see the good, I think, and that it's not a matter of going out there and fighting the evildoer, but to find what good there is in humankind, which is our intelligence, our capacity to think, and to look to the future. So that looking to the future, as Daniel Burke did in his thinking about his daughter 6 years from now and perhaps seeing a landing on the moon or Mars, is very thrilling, and yet also the capacity to look at other gifted figures like Helen Keller and her capacity to overcome terrible things. But the sort of, to put it in a bottom line, concrete way, in addition to the important philosophical material that Dennis Small was talking about with Plato and Nicholas of Cusa, et cetera, is that economic justice is really what we all need for mankind, and not under a global system, but each country needs to find its own way to creatively help individuals fulfill their potential. And with that, we will discover how to create the fusion that's needed to go beyond to other universes. So thank you so much. I wish maybe you can find a question in there, or it may just be my statement of having been transformed and inviting other people to reflect and to look at themselves and what do they believe in. I guess that's it. Thank you.
I have an idea. I think that Dennis might want to say something about this idea of the good. Just so we clarify one element, the idea of the do-gooder comes actually from Cotton Mather, from a set of essays called Bonifacius, or Essays to Do Good. I think it was written, 1710. The phrase do-gooder has become a slander as a result of the intent to slander the Mathers. And the Mather family of Massachusetts were the intellectual ancestors of Benjamin Franklin. They gave Benjamin Franklin his mission, his assignment to go down to Philadelphia, to Pennsylvania, and join James Logan and others down there at the point that the revolutionary government of Massachusetts, the Commonwealth, had been crushed after the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And sort of important just to know that even that notion of doing good, as opposed to the doing of evil, that itself is a political idea that evolved out of the American Revolution. So I just wanted to reference that. But also, the reason this might be a useful point of departure, Dennis may have something to say about, is that James Logan, whom Benjamin Franklin went down to visit and work with in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, had the largest library in the colonies, and he'd become a very famous, he had become an important defender of the work of Gottfried Leibniz. And it's Leibniz who is the primary intellectual force for the founding of the United States. Not in the sense that he was the founder, but he represents the intellectual standpoint, not John Locke, which is what virtually every American historian and constitutional expert teaching in universities today says. John Locke is not that whatsoever, or actually none of them ever mention Gottfried Leibniz. And it might be a useful point of departure, since Leibniz also had the famous fight with Isaac Newton, so that the whole issue of what we've been talking about, including today, about science versus superstition, the idea of Plato versus the priesthood of these evildoers, is sort of placed right there in what you said in your discussion. So Dennis might have something on this, I think.
Well, that was a home run pitch, that's for sure. I think that what you were saying about the question of wanting to, not Dennis, but I'm sorry, I don't know your name, ma'am, but your comments a moment ago are really to the point about wanting to do good and wanting to change things, but that you learned a whole lot about the way to do it. This is really, really important, because it is not enough to just have a desire to do something good, however you might want to define good, and I'll come to that in a second. That's important. That's a prerequisite. That's a sine qua non. It's a necessary but not a sufficient guidepost to one's life, because you have to couple that. You have to marry that intense emotional desire to do something positive, to use your life for something good, to make something a contribution of significance, which is how most people come around the LaRouche movement in one way or another. They tend to be people who want to change things for the good. But I think pretty much 99.9% of us, when you first come around, you may have that intention and desire, but you actually either have no idea of what to actually do, or an idea which is just flat out wrong. Not because you intended it to be wrong, but because you have to combine that moral drive with a scientific understanding of how to go about doing that. We each have been granted one and only one mortal life. We end up sooner or later vanishing physically from this earth, and therefore you have a finite period of time, which can be long or short, and of course one hopes that it is long and not short, but you have a finite period of time in which to do something of immortal value. How do you do something infinite with something finite? And the desire to do it is crucially important, but it's not sufficient. You have to figure out how you can use that very finite, limited period of time to do that. What is the most effective trajectory? How do you go about doing it? What can you do? How can you use your capabilities, your talents, develop new ones? How can you contribute? What can you actually do with your life? And that's where LaRouche comes in, and I think challenged each and every one of us when either personally, if we were fortunate enough to know him at the time, or indirectly through his writings, if you didn't know him personally, when you first get in touch with the LaRouche movement, that's exactly what happens, is that you're shaken to your very roots by thinking about, maybe what I'm doing is actually going to boomerang. Maybe it's not going to work that way. Maybe this is going to backfire. And this is something that's really important, I think, with how we address youth today and the problem of the green movement. Most of the people involved in the young kids involved in the green movement today, they're not philosophical fascists, or they don't intend to be. To the degree to which we can show them that they're being led around by the nose, or the big brass ring through their nose, by the very financial interests that they despise, by the Rockefellers, by the Buffetts, and so on and so forth, and that their entire approach is being guided and directed by people who are manipulating them and turning them into cannon fodder to bring about fascism. To the degree to which we can show them that what they hopefully is guiding them, which is the idea of doing something to help, is actually doing the exact opposite, the very least that will do is provoke a huge crisis in people. They'll get angry. They'll get really pissed off. They'll rip up our leaflets. They'll kick over our literature tables. They'll yell and scream. They'll denounce us on Facebook. All sorts of things will happen. But out of 100, 10 or maybe one will think. And the person you're looking for is that one who's prepared to question their own axioms, question their own what's going on, who are honest enough with themselves, concerned enough with the world to say, wait a second, what if these LaRouche guys are right? I don't think they are, but what if they actually are? Then what? So you have to do exactly as you were suggesting. You have to figure out how to do not only some good, but the very best you possibly can. So that with your finite time on this earth, you're actually doing the maximum. So I think that's really important. I mean, otherwise, in terms of some of the issues which Dennis was raising, this does go to the very heart of the basis on which the United States was founded. I mean, the crucial importance of the United States. Sure, it's the economic policies of Hamilton. Yes, it has to do with the whole idea of national sovereignty. It has to do with the whole idea of balance of power, all sorts of interesting things, the constitutional system, and so on and so forth. But really, the crucial issue is that we were organized to be a nation of do-gooders, not in the sense of people who think they get themselves off the hook by handing out crumbs to beggars, that kind of do-gooders, not lady do-rightlies, but do-gooders in exactly the way that Cotton Mather and others and Leibniz meant, which is that you have to be the right hand of the creator in making sure that this is actually the best of all possible worlds. That this is the best of all possible worlds, or universes, as Daniel was rightly pointing out, in the sense that we are endowed with a capability to join in the process of creation, to make sure that on the basis of an understanding of God's presumptive will, which is where science comes in, we actually use our limited powers and capabilities we have to bring about the maximum good and to derive from that the greatest possible happiness. Not pleasure, but happiness. And that's where the Leibniz question comes in. The issue of goodness and happiness and optimism are identical concepts, as hopefully will have become clear over the course of what the three of us have been talking about today in one way or another. Leibniz is the author, in fact, of the concepts on which the United States was founded: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is not, as you may have noticed in your studies, that does not say life, liberty, and the pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain. That is not the basis of founding the United States. That's the Benthamites, that's Locke, that's hedonism. And it's not just a totally different idea of what is happiness and pleasure, it's a totally different idea of what a human being actually is. It is that concept of man that we have to reproduce in the reproduction of man. And I think that's actually the central issue here. If we understand that our mission as a nation is not to make things good inside the United States, but it is to share and recreate and reproduce that capability with every sovereign nation on the planet. If we understand that our national mission is one of generosity, because that is what makes us good and happy, then we will be returning to the real roots of the United States. People make fun of Cotton Mather and they make fun of Lyndon LaRouche, but they have no idea what they're talking about. Lyndon LaRouche is a classic American par excellence. That outlook is the American outlook, and anything less than that is un-American.
Thanks so much.
I'll just make a brief comment and then I'd love to hear what you have to say, Alvin. I think that Dennis is certainly right that most of the people who are involved in the environmentalist movement, these are people who are young and they have a sense that something has gone terribly wrong in the world, which of course it has, and they have a kind of a pain in the pit of their stomach, and they say, what does it mean? What is my connection to that? And then the Pied Piper comes along and tells them, oh, there's a very simple explanation. The human race needs to be, exterminated. And it's not said quite like that. It's said, we have to limit the use of resources. We have to change our way of life. We have to reduce consumption. Consumption's bad. Don't you agree with me? And all of these sort of ways to cajole people into going along with something that they never really consider with any depth. And I know that. I know that because we've been on these campuses for 6 months, going back to, in particular, in a shifted way since Mr. LaRouche's passing, and the young people do have a surface belief in this, but once you give them a chance to think and to get out of the fishbowl, once you provoke them in such way that you're not merely trying to replace the opinion that they've adopted, but rather cause them to come to a process of mentation, which is what classical culture is intended to do. It's what tragedy is intended to do. It's what poetry is intended to do. Then they drop it, and their interest, they want to know. They want to know what it is that they've been kept from knowing. And I think, put this whole thing in context of this document and the one that will be coming out in a couple of weeks, because we just mobilized like mad to make sure that we could get this thing printed and to get this thing out. And now we have it, and I genuinely have to say, we have, as someone who, I'm in my early 30s, until this year, how much connection did I have to the idea, to a clear notion of what will happen in the next 40 to 50 years? And I say that as someone who's been associated with Mr. LaRouche for a long time, or for 7 years of my life. And I was thinking about all these things. But at the same time, you had Obama over your back, leaning over, lobbing drones, right? and it's, it was really terrifying. It was really scary to be a young person under Bush and Obama. It was really, really scary. And now we have a kind of a parting of the clouds, and the sun is kind of coming in, and it is within what, and I'll just, there's other things to address which I will bring up, including about Booker and other things, but I'd say that there's a parting of the clouds right now, and what you see is the potential to do what LaRouche was talking about. LaRouche's mission is today, which is to create a world system in which the system of nation states, or whatever it evolves into, is organized around the principle, the idea that the purpose of human civilization is the advancement of the creative powers of man, is the development of the creative powers of man, is the willful self-evolution to what would become a galactic species. That's really what we're headed towards right now.
One additional thought provoked by what Daniel was just saying, which is with these young kids, what these guys are trying to do is not simply to recruit them to the idea of saying and repeating and organizing, yeah, the world has too many people and we should cut back consumption and so on. That's really true. But the really bad thing, what they're really trying to do is when young people start thinking and saying that, they're destroying their souls. That's what they're out to do. They're trying to turn people into actual do-gooders, in the Cotton Mather sense, into animals. And that's the maximum destruction. That's what they're really trying to do. I mean, imagine you're holding up to people's face, to their eyes, an image of starving kids in Yemen. Or, there's one picture we published in EIR of this little Peruvian girl who had just had coca because the pain of not eating was, just so great she couldn't stand it. And you're holding up to people those images, and in the face of that, if they say, yes, there's overconsumption, there's too many people, they're destroying their own souls. And that's really what the British are out to do in this whole thing. And that's what we have to save them from. So it's just an additional thought that came to mind as Daniel was saying what he had to say at the beginning especially.
Hi, Dennis. Alvin in New York. On Thursday's call, Barbara recommended to all of us on there that we look at LaRouche's 1999 paper. I believe the title is Star Wars and Littleton. And so I started this yesterday. It's a typical, very long, in-depth piece from Lynn, so I'm not finished with it yet. But along the lines of what is being discussed today, there are clearly parallels, and this is 20 years ago. I just want to read something briefly and then ask my question. Early on in the document, in the paper, he warns the reader to please stop deluding yourself with today's customary simplistic knee-jerk explanations of almost everyone and everything. Merely ending the sale of satanic video games such as Doom or exposing the dangers posed by the Star Wars series will not put this horror back in the box from whence it came. This new problem of terrorism must be attacked by focusing on the conditions which many readers have been complicitly condoning. Face the fact that it might be your negligent tolerance which has contributed to the popularizing of such video games and cult films, especially the spread of those among suggestible children and adolescents. Now, this subject of suggestible children and adolescents, he goes on and takes us into Africa, where the British policies of arming young, starving Africans with Kalashnikovs, of course, also at that time, the day traders of Wall Street, who killed many more people. And what he was getting at was the epistemological principle operating. Now, I remember way past my adolescence as an adult, sitting down and really listening to The Marriage of Figaro, where the character Cherubino has a number of arias where this subject of adolescence is taken up. And obviously there are many beautiful things about it, but that for me was one of the most touching moments of the opera, because of the, yes, humor, but humanity and sensitivity and amount of reason that was given this character. And of course, it's something that we all lacked during our periods of adolescence, which you go 20, 30, 40 years later, you go with successive generations that have adopted the views that are being discussed here that we have to defeat. And you begin to get the enormity of the problem as Lynn is laying out for us in this paper, Star Wars and Littleton. What I ask of you is, he talks about the unknown field of epistemological science as a science, and that in order for us to defeat this, we have to get to the underlying axiomatic epistemological principles that are operating. And if you could help us by elaborating on that some more.
That's a fair question. It's huge also. I mean, I think that's some of what I was trying to get at with this issue of epistemology is the science or the philosophy of how you know, the method of knowing, your method of knowing what's true and what's false. And what you get with Plato is the idea that there is such a thing as absolute truth, not absolute in the sense that it's fixed or frozen, or, that kind of a fixed idea, but quite the contrary. It's the principles generating the process of motion. It's the idea of an idea or a hypothesis. So you get that. With Cusa, the thing is advanced dramatically, where he discusses the way that what you actually know, the way you know things, is by knowing the process of knowing. So it's a self-reflexive process. What you're looking at and what you're understanding is only the way your mind is interacting with the object of its own activity. So you don't know the object, you don't know the subject. The only thing you know is the process in which you're changing that relationship. Now, if that sounds to you like a self-reflexive concept which cannot possibly be explained by mathematics or formal logic, and as the mathematicians will tell you, they'll start pulling their hair out and saying that it can't possibly exist because it cannot be so expressed. It is exactly that. It is not expressible logically, mathematically. It is self-reflexive. It also happens to be true. It's the way the actual physical universe works and the way man's mind works. So that's, I think, just definitionally what you're talking about when you talk about epistemology, and therefore the science of epistemology is actually the science of the way the human mind works to actually grapple with and grasp universal principles, which it is in the process of discovering and creating, which is the topic we touched on. I really don't think we could say that we did a whole lot more than that, but we touched on it. What I think is worth emphasizing and re-emphasizing here is that what Lynn always stressed with us, and when we were the youth generation, when he recruited us, which was 45, 50 years ago, and which he stressed again every time he recruited a new youth generation. And I'm fond of describing the LaRouche organization as a series of youth movements that LaRouche created, some a little older than others, but we're all a youth movement effectively. that the crucial thing that had to be done is you had to understand the ideological problems that characteristically block your country, your language group, your culture, your age group, your peers from understanding these concepts, these things which are most distinctively human, which are difficult not so much because they're conceptually that difficult. Some of them are, certainly if you read through Lynn, they're very challenging, but they're more than that. They're emotionally challenging. Because what they are demanding of you as the reader or as the person who's hearing this is a shift in your own identity. So people have trouble actually understanding what you're talking about, not because what you're saying or what Lynn is saying is all that complicated, but because the implications of that to them, in terms of their identity and therefore what they're going to do with their life, is profound. Which is why it's extremely difficult, almost sometimes impossible, to get that kind of shift in older people who have already developed for themselves a fully developed, ossified sense of identity, usually with a profession accompanying it, financial obligations, family, kids, things that they don't think they can change, and why youth are far more prone to being willing to think in revolutionary terms because they haven't, it hasn't, the concrete hasn't yet set. So you can actually do something there. Not that it's impossible with older people, but that's the phenomenon you're dealing with. And Lynn has always talked about the need for these national ideology projects. You have to get inside the working of the mind, the problems, the emotional problems, the psychological problems that prevent people from understanding basic scientific concepts. And we as organizers have to deal with that and understand that and be able to laugh at our own foibles and problems and see how our own minds work if we are to have a prayer of a chance of organizing other people. So that this subjective emotional side of it is absolutely crucial to the science of epistemology or the epistemology of science. Same point. Means exactly the same thing. And what that means in terms of the United States may mean one thing. In a Russian society, it means something different. With youth today, it's a little different than it was in youth during my youth, but it's the same kind of problem. It's different in Hispanic societies, as you know. But we have never, ever, ever been able to recruit and actually get people to join the way Plato tells his followers to join. Follow me. Follow me in life and in death. Follow me because this is the only thing that gives pleasure, that gives you actual joy and happiness under these circumstances. Regardless of the personal sacrifices, people will not do that unless they're able to attach their emotions to the eternal part of their identity and not to the mortal part of it, to put it simply. That's why this issue of this paradox, which Lynn addressed in discussing this transition from Plato to Jesus Christ to Nicholas of Cusa, is actually so relevant. So that's what I would add to the discussion on this thing. The way Lynn posed this issue in the quote that you read is far better than anything I could come up with to really stick it to people in terms of what they have to do to help address these problems. And the same point applies today in terms of what we have to do as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
I think do we have any other questions? Yes, go ahead. Come on up. Good. We'll make this our final question, and then we have a couple of remarks on the committees of correspondence, and then closing remarks.
First of all, I would like to say thank you very much for the panel. It's very inspiring. This is my very first exposure to LaRouche. I happen to work with the Kingdom of Bhutan. They have gross national happiness as a way to guide their national policy. And they, by applying that in their constitution, they now become the first country in the world that is carbon negative. So I thought, since you mentioned happiness, I thought I mentioned that. As a country, they do have gross national happiness as to guide all their national policy. But I do have a question for the panel. I'm currently working with a company called Shuttle that is the first space travel market place to take people into space. So you can actually experience different experience going to space, from zero-G to suborbital to lower Earth orbit to orbiting around the ISS, the International Space Station, and going to the moon. I happen to be to be a permanent optimistic person, and know a lot of people that are very optimistic as well. And so I know a lot of people that are very interested in going to space, and we have been talking about it. And I was just walking and deep in thought yesterday. I said, I'm going to space, I'm going to space. I know I'm going to go there, I don't know how. And then I ran into Dan with the sign that say, we are going to Moon and Mars. So I said, I have to stop. It's like in the great resonance. So I have to stop and say, well, I thought maybe it's a joke, but then it looks like he started to give me all kind of science and physics behind it. I say, well, this is real, so this is why I'm here. So Mike, I do have a very practical questions. I know going to space is expensive, so do you have any program? Do you have any kind of recommendation that you can recommend to us what to do, what to take? Let's say we say yes, we are all going into the moon, going to set up to have I even hear about the resettlement program in the moon as well. That's been on it for like 20 years. So what are the actions that we need to take as I'm going to be out there and talking to a lot of my friends? What do you recommend?
Daniel, this one's for you.
I thought it was for you.
No. This is for you, Daniel. I mean, I think the first step you need to do is throw a couple of Wall Street bankers in jail, and probably Al Gore too. After that, what you should do is what Daniel's about to tell you.
Well, I think you should support my Senate campaign. I think we need to support the LaRouche PAC, and there's the pamphlet that we're getting out is a petition with 6 steps. The one that Dennis referred to is actually maybe 0.5 or something, but it's absolutely essential. It comes first chronologically, as he said. On how to get this Moon-Mars mission going. And what we seek to do is to give a mission, LaRouche called it a science driver, whereby you can organize the best of the creative powers of the people. And so I would directly caution against the kind of Elon Musk notion of space, which was, he used it as a big commercial by throwing that Tesla out into space. I would caution against that, because what we're actually trying to figure out how to do is create conditions where every human being has a potential to live a life of meaning. And that means that we need to increase the productivity, the standard of living of the population 10 times over in a rapid period of time. There needs to be universal education such that no one is left in the darkness of ignorance. And that means that today we need to discuss, we need to refute the claim that man-made carbon dioxide is creating a climate catastrophe. I want to share with you that this is one of the Zeusian myths that is being brought onto our human society. In fact, I was going to reference earlier that the key hypotheses, well, I'll put it differently. If you want a kind of a window into what's being done around this matter, take a look at what's happened with publication of an interview in Forbes magazine this week with an Israeli scientist who's a collaborator of a Danish scientist named Svensmark. And these are people who have done an analysis of the role of the sun in the power of the sun and its effect on cosmic radiation in causing a change in the amount of clouds that cloud cover on the planet. And what they've shown, and you will not find this in the IPCC report, they forbid this material from being presented, is that when you take this phenomenon into account, then there's absolutely no contribution, no significant contribution whatsoever. There's not none at all, but no significant contribution of man-made CO2 to the change in the temperature of the climate. But guess what? Forbes magazine was forced to retract this within a day or two, and they pulled it off of their website and said, "Oh, actually, we can't show this to you." And I think that what we're dealing with right now is there's maybe other people have the same sense that we've gone into as Barbara Boyd discussed it, a new phase of the coup against the president, or I would say an incredible increase in the use of fear to try to cause people to be pessimistic. And I saw this in the street, and on the day that we met, there was people who were very explicit. I can't. Did you hear what they did? Did you hear that they released the list of 44 people who contributed the maximum to President Trump's campaign? They released it on social media and broadcast it. They have similar things like this, or like Cory Booker saying that that the Trump rallies should be canceled because the use of free speech in this way threatens Americans. There's a kind of a climate that they're trying to create, which is in a certain sense totally laughable. Like the idea of a presidential candidate saying, "My opponent shouldn't be allowed to have rallies." It's kind of like a pretty weak argument. But there's if we want to pierce through what are frauds, which is what my view is. I mean, I think we'll discuss the whole thing, but that's the all of the environmentalist claims about population are complete frauds, and about carbon dioxide, it's a total fraud. If we want to pierce through this, we're going to have to, if we're going to have the kind of willful evolution of the human species that I know you desire from our discussions. So perhaps the most important thing to do, in addition to the explicit steps that are in this pamphlet, which are foundational, is to figure out what are those frauds that have been introduced into my own way of thinking, with this question of CO2 being a critical one.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Let me say something about both the last question and the prior question from Alvin, by way of talking about the committees of correspondence. There's an idea that we put forward concerning how this pamphlet would function, and I think it's important in terms of what we mean by the presidency, because we're not merely talking about Donald Trump here. We're talking about a very specific tradition in America. It doesn't involve every American president. It's a very specific group of them. And this is a commission to a particular mission involving very specific technologies that do very specific things. One of the most important elements of what these technologies do is that they change the way in which energy production and direction is done to directed energy usage, so that you're not talking about trying to drive a turbine to heat water to generate heat, for example. You're not talking about using chemical reactions in rockets. You're talking about a form, by use of particularly thermonuclear fusion, of tuning the light spectrum. You're doing something which, from a conceptual standpoint, has to be taught to the American people, not as an abstracted scientific principle, but we're going to teach it through singing, because it's the same. It has to do with what's called bel canto singing, or the notion of tuning and use of the proper forms of tuning, such as with the A432, and the notion of human voice registration, which is got a similarity in terms of the practice of doing it to usage of different elements of the electromagnetic spectrum. It's not the same thing, but it has a certain kind of useful parallel that we're talking about the idea of a different way entirely of approaching the question of energy throughput. With LaRouche and his idea of energy flux density, this idea of Lyndon LaRouche is a crucial idea, together with his idea of potential relative population density. And these are ideas that, in terms of their applications in economics, he uniquely pioneered. Nobody else had done this. There are people that understood the ideas, like Gottfried Leibniz. Now, why does this refer to the committees of correspondence? What is a committee of correspondence? What's the idea? It's not just a chapter of organization. It's not just people becoming members and then you advocate a particular social policy. The question that was asked was, well, where's the money going to come from for this? Actually, this isn't based on money. This is based on an economy. An economy has very little to do with money. So that's the first thing we're going to teach people. Physical economy money is tertiary in a physical economy. It's important as a form of directed credit, but the money itself is a form of circulating that directed credit for these particular purposes. So just to say something about our committees. Our committees are going to be involved in a set of different activities. There are our deployments, the way you were met and others have been met out on the street, where we're out there and we're doing a very specific kind of advocacy. There are meetings like this where people are able to come in and become acquainted, particularly with what has happened during the week. Then there are schools in which we can actually have discussions or further deeper study about or various of the documents that we have written and then others have written. For example, the reading of the Platonic dialogues is something that we've done a certain amount with. There are the concerts and the work of our chorus and what we do there, which is a different kind of thing. There are our weekly conference calls, in which what we're doing with that is that people are discussing the results of the work that they've been doing during the week, and then the obstacles as well as the changes that have happened in that process. And there's other elements that we'll be going to be adding in. I want to say this because this is an ensemble of activities intended to create a form of dialogue. Now, the form of dialogue is intended to change the experience, the daily cultural experience that people have, particularly of what is falsely called music, because it is through the form of music which is the primary way in which the minds of the American people are being systematically, daily destroyed. It's not merely hip-hop, it's not merely folk music or what used to be called rock music. It's all of what they associate with the term. And the way that we are counterposing this, the dialogue process that's required for people to save their nation requires a completely different notion of counterpoint. The counterpoint of ideas, not just, in other words, debate. It's not debate. It's the ability to listen. The ability to listen requires contrapuntal motion. That's what happens, and that's what is experienced in the choruses. It's not merely that you take a point of view which is opposite to your own. It's the ability to consider several points of view at one time and to know that truth is not in any of them. That the idea of having a national dialogue in order that we come by some conclusions about things that we might not yet really understand. Take, for example, thermonuclear fusion. One thing that we can say for sure is that the Extinction Rebellion, otherwise known as the Extermination Rebellion, which is headed up by people who say that the way that they came by their revelation about the catastrophe that threatens the earth was by massive doses of LSD. They say that. When you're dealing with that, that's not exactly a recommendation for scientific acumen. So when you're dealing with that, are you really going to debate with those people about their view of the climate. You don't do that. That's what I mean by the music issue. You don't have a discussion about whether or not these things are that. But I say this because the idea involved is there's a different message, and that's what we've heard, of optimism. And this concept of optimism won't be convincing if people don't think they're working on it as a social unit. So you have to work against the premise of what's called social media, which is one of the most asocial things ever invented in human history. Okay, I mean, forget it. People are completely privatized. You're on your own phone. You're texting. People are trying to talk to you. You're texting in the middle. You know, your eyes are, you have rapid eye movement. You can't concentrate past 5 minutes. If you look at something printed, basically you go to sleep after about 45 seconds into it. That's what's happened. So what we have to do is reverse all of this and find a way to do it. And the committees of correspondence are intended to do that. That's what the conception is. So it's not just, oh, we're going to correspond by writing each other text messages about the good things we did or something like that. Or we're going to correspond by just, we'll go out on the street deployment and that's better. No, the notion is that there's an idea about a new form of composition, mental composition, ideas, how they're composed. Now, this is not new with us. This is something that J.S. Bach did. This is something that, very, very importantly, Beethoven did. And talking about this idea about freedom being the liberation from the senses, the prison of the senses. Optimism is the freedom from the prison of the senses, which Daniel quoted. That is the point. That is the point. Ideas are not, are things that are virtually dimensionless. And this is what we are trying to get people to see. They are not their bodies. There are not other races. You are not divided in races. That very idea is absurd. There's only one race. It's called the human race. That's it. So, just the fact that this gets continually repeated, all over the place shows you that the conception that you're trying to get across, but what is that made of? And it's made of this idea of the human mind. But what is that made of? Is there a difference between the soul and the mind? There clearly seems to be a difference between the body and the mind. There's a difference between the soul and the mind. These are matters that are crucial to policy. So I think that the idea of the committees of correspondence, just to say, finally, is some people know that this is the case and some people don't. Alexander Hamilton created the first great science project for the federal government in the form of the infrastructure project called the Lighthouse Project, which was to create lighthouses all along the eastern seaboard. John Quincy Adams, when he came in to office as the president, in his inaugural address, talked about what he called the lighthouses of the skies, the astronomy observatories. And he talked about how there were many of these in Europe and there was none in America. And you had to have an observatory created. And there were a lot of jokes were made about him as a result of this. But he wanted that idea. When you look at that, and of course, John Quincy Adams was an actual veteran of the American Revolution, just like Alexander Hamilton was, because when he was 8 years old, he was a spy. He acted as a spy for his father, John Adams. So you have him, and then you have Abraham Lincoln and his Transcontinental Railroad, his famous stump speech on discoveries and inventions, and his proposal that the United States would have 500 million people by the year 1900. Then you have, after that, Franklin Roosevelt, of course, the governor of New York, and the major proponent, of course, of through the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, and many other things, of technological progress, who was a descendant of Alexander Hamilton, of Isaac Roosevelt, who was collaborated with Alexander Hamilton, and finally JFK. The irony, of course, is that today's Democratic Party appears to be hell-bent on opposing JFK's space program in the form of Donald Trump's proposal. So when you look at this, our committees of correspondence job is to bring people back to the American presidency And our candidacies for office or our meetings each week, these are all of a piece. This is a concept where the American people recognize that they are the presidency. And the presidency is enhanced by, it's amplified by, it's restored by, it's renewed by what the American people do. And that's the way to relate to Donald Trump. Stop blaming him for what he doesn't know or might not know. Or they have a president calling for a new space program and a new culture. I'll take it. So this is what we have to do, and this is what our function is. If there aren't other questions, I'd just like at this point to have both Daniel and Dennis give us some concluding remarks. Which one of you would like to go first?
I'll go first. I want to say something which I'm sure Daniel will say more about.
All right.
In early September, the first week of September, we're going to have an international week of action to take exactly this brawl to the campuses in the United States and internationally. It'll be to present the space program as the solution, the antidote to this poison, this green poison, which the youth have been fed in particular. We're going to have a single international leaflet, which will be distributed. Daniel's campaign is going to be in the forefront of this. They'll be, over the course of a week, hitting about a dozen campuses or whatever we can manage to do in New Jersey and in New York. This will be done perhaps not for a whole week, but for a day or two at least. We will hit university campuses in Mexico, in the cities of Mexico City, Hermosillo, Sonora, Querétaro, Mexico, also in Lima, Peru, and in Guatemala City. We will also be doing this in Paris, probably some other cities in France as well, in Germany, also in a number of cities, and possibly, I think there's a good possibility, in South Africa as well. So the point is, across the planet, we're acting, we're moving on this thing, and we're going to do this in a really big way and make a big splash and amplify it through the social media and so on and so forth. We need your help. Everything Dennis said about money is true. But you have to add to that we need money to be able to make these ideas work. And I mean, think about it. When it comes to be your time to check out, do you really want to say, well, I used my money I had to go to the corner grocery store, or well, I had to pay this much on my credit card, and that's what I did? Or would you like to say, I contributed to make it possible to bring ideas to youth that are actually capable of saving the species? One small thing. But it's a small thing in the right direction, along with all of the other things which the LaRouche movement is doing. But this in particular, I think, and Daniel's campaign as the flagship of this movement is absolutely critical to bring all of these ideas we've been discussing directly down to the organizing situation on the ground. So join us in that in every way you can. And that's how I wanted to conclude my remarks for today.
I am so happy to hear you say that, Dennis. That makes me really happy. And, upon reflection, this is really the answer to the question that you posed about how do we get to the moon. It was what I was trying to communicate in my presentation, that we have to create a vanguard in the youth who know what truthful principles can be brought to bear to create the next 50 years. And I think also in that process of trying to take what optimism lives within you and communicate it and evoke it in a young person, it demands rigorous inspection of your own axioms and of the received ideas that we've brought into ourselves that have been forced on us, and a chance to renew your perspective on things. So it is going to be so much fun, and all of you have to be there. Every single person who's at this meeting has to come, especially you, and because we need a flood of people on the campuses, and the movement needs to grow. Obviously, our movement should grow. I think that if you take into think about what Dennis just said. We have people all over the world who are part of this. The issue is not so much the United States as such, which is what most people think. They think, okay, we're going into a 2020 election campaign, and the issue is the U.S. You know, I mean, the Democratic debates, how many hours did these people blather on? And they talked about, first of all, they talked about foreign policy for like 6 minutes or something like this, you know, like the wars that we're waging or that need to be stopped, the regime change wars that have been going on for so long. They barely even commented on it. And then they didn't mention the space program once. And even, you know, Trump has taken a track now. He's finally starting to talk about the space program in his rallies. It's very important. So Americans are convinced that politics is a matter of, you know, what's going on TV. Or actually, I'm not sure that Americans are really convinced of that because, of course, Trump won. But the key thing that we need to bring to them is the world strategic situation. You know, we have to give them the new paradigm. That's the whole point. And I think that what Dennis said about how young people have not yet become set in the sclerotic traditions of the day, that is so important. We will be able to mobilize these people, and you take those young people into a normal political situation that's happening in the United States, and they're going to blow people's minds. They're going to be so amazed that there are young people who are talking about the next 40, 50 years and have a concept of how to do that. And what we're going to do is we're going to train them. That's the whole idea. We're going to educate them. We're going to inspire them. We're going to take them very close and discuss the meaning of their lives and try to find the meaning of our own. And so I'll say sort of finally on this that we have what we bring from this period that we're going to do the first week of September, and in this region we'll be doing things a few days before that too, in the week that comes prior. So be prepared for that, everyone who's here, is going to give us power to go to things like the UN Climate Change Conference that's happening blocks from here on the 23rd of September, and we're going to make sure that the humanist perspective, the new paradigm, is introduced there. And that it's done with a fighting passion for the human race, from the standpoint of agape that Mr. LaRouche defined, as I know of no one else who has done so in such a clear and beautiful and loving way. So that's how I would like to end my comments, is certainly to support everything that Dennis just said, and I'm very excited, and I'm demanding that you join us.
Okay, with that, we're going to draw today's meeting to a close. So I want to thank everybody for being here with us. I want to thank everybody that's viewing this, and I want to urge that everybody do exactly what was just outlined and help us do what the human race wants us to do and wants to do itself, and what we can do so well, and that is to have people have fun.
Yes.
Okay, that's it.